Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video we're going to have a look at a past HSC question from the 2018 economics exam. Link to the exam and marking guideline will be in the description. The question is all about globalization, and the reason that I've chosen to go through this question is because it takes a little bit of a different angle on globalization. The first part, pretty straightforward, but the second part is looking a bit differently in terms of how Australia has contributed to globalization rather than how globalization has affected Australia. So it's important that we can be prepared for all sorts of questions that come up, including stuff like this. So what we're going to do is we'll go through some ideas on what you could discuss. I'm going to have a setup where on the left-hand side we'll have the question and the right-hand side we'll have the marking guidelines and suggested answers. But as you'll see, they'll only get you part of the way. If you want those higher marks, you're going to have to include much more detail. Okay, let's get stuck into it. Here we are, the globalization question. 2018 New South Wales Economics HSC, we're looking at question 23. So the first part for 4 marks says, explain one cost and one benefit of globalization. So if we're explaining for 2 marks, it's a bit of an ask, but I think we can do it. If we think about some of the costs of globalization, something you could talk about would be that globalization can lead to greater environmental damage. And one of the ways you could explain that is that some countries have lower environmental standards in order to attract investment, including from TNC. So they're like, come and set up over here. The requirements are much less stringent. The regulations aren't as harsh. So that could result in environmental damage, which is not a good thing. Another potential cost is contagion. Always good to use economic terms where you can. So contagion here being like sort of in the sense of a virus, where we're saying a downturn or a cold in one economy is transmitted to another because of the links created by globalization. So what we're saying is that if globalization didn't exist, if the countries were independent of the other, that if one country has a downturn, the other one is not necessarily affected. But because of globalization, because of the links and the integration between economies, a downturn in one will be transmitted to another. So I know we only have to explain one, but I thought I'd include 2 here. If we go over here, we can see that one potential cost of globalization is the increased exposure of the economy to the international business cycle. This means that governments have less control over achieving their economic objectives. So I think it's an interesting point. You could definitely include that as part of contagion, in terms of that the governments sort of have less control if the downturns are being transmitted. That's the benefit. We'll come back to that. Increased income inequality, that could be a good one to discuss. Widening income wealth gap between countries as well. Costs and benefits of TNCs and environment. So we could look at that as something as well. Okay, so let's shift across to the benefits. So if we're looking at the benefits of globalization, I think it's really important to discuss trade. That if we've got a situation of nations being more integrated and then increasing that flow of goods and services, that's going to improve living standards for consumers all around the world. So to put it a bit more formally, so we're saying that globalization involves free trade, which can lead to higher living standards. So we're saying greater access to more goods and services at lower prices via the trade flows. And then as well, we're talking about that globalization, free trade also involves reductions in protection, which again is part of the reason why we create that situation. So a clear benefit of globalization, okay, so free trade. If we also think about more benefits here, that you could see a potential benefit, greater choice of products and services. Okay, so we've included that here. What we might talk about here is another potential benefit of globalization would be greater migration, because just as there are greater trade links here, there are greater people links in terms of this element. So what we're saying is that if we've got more migration, we've got greater labour mobility, so labour can move to different countries. And this means that we get this skills and knowledge transfer between economies, which can help them grow and develop as well. If you look over here, faster spread of technology, we talked about free trade. If we look at 23B, this is the question that's a bit more tricky. Also, this question is worth 6 marks. So that's more than a quarter of an essay for this one short answer question. Not even the whole question, as a sort of sub-question within this short answer. So it says, explain how Australia has contributed to the process of globalization. So the reason that I found this interesting is usually the discussion is, how has globalization affected Australia? Because Australia, while it's sort of important in the world economy, is not a very large economy in the scheme of things. So it's not often discussed that Australia has had some kind of influence. So if we think about the kind of relationship or the direction here, what we're saying is, how has Australia contributed to the process of globalization? So that's the important distinction. Not how globalization has affected Australia, but how has Australia contributed to globalization? In thinking about this question, I think it would be useful to look at the drivers of globalization. So if we go back here, and I've taken this from my own video, which I'll link in the description, of course, that we can think about 5 things that lead to greater globalization. So trading goods and services, financial flows, investment in T&Cs, technology, transport and communication, and the international division of migration and labour. So not all of these will be relevant for Australia, but what we might say is that, okay, so how has Australia contributed to globalization? Well, we could definitely talk about trade, that Australia has been heavily involved in trade, and that has involved greater linkages between economies. We could talk about investment and the work of T&Cs into Australia as well. So we could also think about international agreements. So what we're saying is that, what has Australia done in each of these things to lead to greater globalization? So with 6 marks on offer, if I've got 3 points and I explain them well, I feel like that's a decent strategy here. So let's grab orange here. So what we might say in terms of trade is that if we think about Australia, that Australia used to be very heavily protected. It used to protect its domestic industries to a large extent. So by reducing protection, it is allowing the freer flow of goods and services, so into Australia and out of Australia, so that is contributing to that process of globalization. That process of globalization, we might think about words here like the integration of economies, synchronization of economies, that kind of thing. We can also think that Australia's commodity exports have been heavily in demand, because Australia's commodity exports are fuel for growth for many countries. So that by freeing up trade and then selling their exports, they have also contributed to those links with other countries. I think that those are useful points to include. If we think here about investment and T&Cs, so that what we can say for this point is that Australia is an open economy. It is not closed, it is open. And this has been particularly true in terms of foreign investment, that Australia has generally encouraged inward foreign investment. And we can see that in terms of the CAT, because Australia, okay, you've got that savings investment gap. In order to fill that Australia has been bringing in foreign investment. So initially more direct, but lately more portfolio. The other thing we can say here is that Australia is home to a number of transnational corporations that operate here. And also there is a lot of foreign investment in Australia's mining industry too. So when mining companies record profits, a bunch of that gets sent back overseas in the form of dividends. So that these are examples here that Australia, again, is contributing to that integration between economies, those links between economies, the investment being allowed in. So that Australia has taken sort of leading positions in terms of encouraging global cooperation and global integration. This is true in terms of Australia's work with the World Trade Organization. In terms of environmental issues, we could look at the Paris Agreement, that Australia is there trying to get links and agreements between economies. And that also, historically, Australia has taken the lead in terms of helping the global economy resolve financial issues. For example, during the financial crisis, the G20, of which Australia is a member, took a leading role in trying to come up with a solution, get agreements between economies, get everyone on the same page to try and address the financial situation. Something we could talk about, which could be interesting and add to your response, so that what you could also say is that actually Australia has sort of contributed against or Australia has taken actions which have led to stumbling blocks in terms of globalization. What I'm thinking about here are bilateral trade agreements. So these bilateral between two nations, two in particular are the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement and the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement. So the argument here is that these countries are forming their own trade agreements, not looking at the global picture, which then is restricting integration and globalization. So when we're saying, explain how Australia has contributed to the process, here we're saying, well, they have contributed negatively because they have engaged in some trade diversion and working against globalization. But in terms of the orange parts here, that the orange parts, investment, TNCs, some of that international agreements, that they have contributed positively. Not very neat today, apologize for that. But that's kind of the things that I would try and include. And I wouldn't be fussed if I'm still writing down the page here because I want to include a lot of information and examples to try and get those 6 marks on offer. If we look at the sample answer here, there is a definition of globalization. I could see that as being a valuable thing to show the market that you understand that. Australia has contributed to the process by following a free trade agenda, reducing protection, increased bilateral trade flows. So you could see here that this sample answer is talking about bilateral as a positive because that is integration. But we can also argue that it's also a bit of a negative because they're just encouraging links between each other and not the world. We didn't need that. The other thing here, Australia has contributed financial flows by deregulating financial markets and permitting foreign banks. That's a really good point here. So what we might do is we might think about, in this investment and TNCs, what would be an example? Well, that once upon a time, there were no foreign banks operating in Australia. Now there are. So that Australia has very much encouraged those global links. As part of that, you can see here commitments in international organizations. We have talked about that. TNCs, migration, investment in communications, floating exchange rate, environment agreements we've talked about here as well. So I think we are on the same page there, but this is just kind of a sample response. This is not an exemplar response. That will not get you the full 6 marks at all. So this was the look at question 23. If you've got any questions, you want to clarify anything, just put that in the comments and I'll see you in the next one.